The Salem Witch Trials of 1692 are the most well-known and widely referenced instances of witch hunts in history. More than 200 people were accused of witchcraft and 20 were executed for their supposed crimes. There is still much debate over the cause of the barbaric trials, with theories ranging from mass hysteria to convulsive ergotism caused by infected rye bread and sleep paralysis. But the uncomfortable truth is that by the time the townspeople of Salem killed 20 of their own, witch hunts were firmly cemented in the practices of many cultures. The earliest witch trials in Europe can be traced back to the 1400s, and from 1484 to 1750, as many as 200,000 so-called witches were tortured, burned, or hanged across Western Europe. In the early 17th century, a particularly heinous bout of panic over witchcraft gripped England when the occult-obsessed King James I ascended to the throne. His book, Demonology, had already been used for several years in his native Scotland to justify the trial and execution of witches, and was reprinted in 1603 when the kingdoms of Scotland and England were united under his reign. The following year, an act against conjuration, witchcraft, and dealing with evil and wicked spirits passed through Parliament, affirming the punishment of witchcraft by death and transferring the trial process from the sole jurisdiction of the Church to the general courts. The result was a marked decrease in the instances of burning at the stake, but also the introduction of many new and terrible methods of determining the presence of witchcraft at trial.
This includes the use of water, which was first introduced in the terrible Northampton Witch Trials in 1612. The method of witch swimming, first used there, would go on to inspire a similar punishment for all manner of sins that was in use as late as the 19th century.
On July the 22nd, 1612, 4 women and 1 man were hanged in Northampton for the crime of practicing witchcraft. Because executions were arranged for public convenience and, in many cases, morbid entertainment, it was not unusual for several witches who had been tried over the previous months to face the gallows together. By the time the nooses were fitted around their necks, the poor souls had likely already endured months of torture and imprisonment. 2 women to face the Abingdon gallows that fateful day were mother and daughter, Agnes Brown and Joan Vaughan of Guilsborough. Their entanglement with witchcraft began when Joan committed an unknown act that offended Mistress Elizabeth Belcher. Whether Joan swore, spit, or accidentally bumped the virtuous and godly gentlewoman was deemed unimportant. So greatly offended was Mistress Belcher's modesty that she was overcome with anger and struck Joan. Elizabeth Belcher said Joan promised to remember the injury and seek revenge. Days later, Mistress Belcher was struck by a sudden violent illness that left her face so disfigured and grimace of pain that it bred both fear and astonishment to all the beholders. When he heard of his sister's illness, Master William Avery came to see her and heard her cry that her disease had been caused by Joan Vaughan and her mother. William went at once to Agnes Brown's house to confront her, but found that a malevolent force held him back, and he was unable to approach the home despite several attempts. Unable to help his sister, William returned home full of sorrow. But it didn't take long before he too was gripped by the same painful illness and had no doubt that both he and his sister had been cursed by witches. He informed the authorities of his suspicions, and Agnes and Joan were arrested and brought to Northampton jail. Believing that if they scratched the witches and drew blood, they would be cured, Elizabeth and William visited the accused and blooded them. They thought themselves instantly healed, but as soon as they left the jail, both became sick again, this time even more violently than before. But Agnes and Joan were apparently not done with the siblings yet. On the coach ride home, two hooded strangers called out a curse as they passed, and the horse pulling their carriage dropped dead. After the jury heard William Avery's testimony at trial, Agnes and Joan insisted on their innocence, but they were sentenced to death, and their guilt was only further cemented by the fact that they were never heard to pray as they awaited their execution. Also executed at the Northampton trials was Helen Jenkinson of Thrapston, who had long been suspected by her neighbours of bewitching cattle and other mischiefs. After being accused of bewitching a child to death, Helen was pricked and searched for a witch's mark. The woman who pricked Helen soon discovered her laundry was covered in images of toads, snakes, and other ugly creatures. She returned to Helen and demanded that her clothing be cleaned, threatening to scratch the witch's eyes out. When she got home, she found her linens white again. Helen was reported to authorities, arrested, and found guilty of witchcraft. Another condemned at the Northampton trials was Mary Barber of Stanwick. From all accounts, Mary was an intensely disliked woman, poor and uneducated. A pamphlet outlining the trials called her monstrous and hideous in both her life and actions, and implied that she behaved in ways not befitting a proper woman of good morals. Mary stood accused of bewitching cattle and bewitching a man to death. No account of the evidence given against Mary was recorded, but she too was found guilty. The final soul condemned in the Northampton trials was Arthur Bill, a poor man from Raunds whose parents were both known witches. More likely, they provided the townspeople with basic medical or spiritual aid. Arthur was accused of bewitching a local woman named Martha Aspinez to death, but there was little evidence to prove he had any connection to the supposed crime. Yet it was generally agreed that Arthur had bewitched cattle and was known to be of an evil life and reputation. And so the judge and officers decided to try an experimental test on all three Bill family members based on advice from demonology, which read, "God has appointed that the water shall refuse to receive them in her bosom that have shaken off the sacred water of baptism." And so mother, father, and son were tied with thumbs and big toes together and thrown into the water.
Possibly into the lake waters here at Northampton's Abington Park.
All three of the accused floated to the surface, which the jury took as a sign that they had spurned the sacrament of baptism and were therefore being rejected by the water. If they had sunk, they surely would have drowned. But what is death to a soul bound for heaven? Arthur's father testified against him at trial to save himself from hanging, and Arthur's mother was so terrified of execution that she cut her own throat. The floating test given to the Bills during the Northampton trial was so popular that it became frequently used over the next several decades, becoming a favourite of the so-called witch-finder general, Matthew Hopkins. But learned men of the law questioned the validity of such tests and argued that the frequent drownings that occurred during them could be tried as murder. The test of swimming a witch was discarded, but a similar punishment called ducking was used for hundreds of years more. Ducking stools were chairs attached to a long beam fixed as a sort of seesaw on the water's edge. A woman could be strapped into the chair and forced underwater repeatedly, as many times as necessary, to cool her immoderate heat. Ducking was nearly exclusively a punishment reserved for women and was designed to humiliate and discourage outspoken females. The ducking stool was used to punish crimes like bearing an illegitimate child or engaging in prostitution, but most commonly it was used to silence women who dared to criticize or argue with others, particularly men. Women who were unafraid to speak their minds were referred to as common scolds and were at risk of being dragged from their homes and strapped into a ducking chair, often in nothing but their shift, where they were subjected to public ridicule and repeatedly dunked into cold water. Some communities kept their ducking stools hidden while not in use, but others installed them permanently beside rivers or ponds to act as a deterrent. In some cases, a woman beginning to cause problems would be greeted by a ducking stool leaning against her front door as a not so subtle warning. Though ducking was not used to determine if a woman was a witch, the targets of both practices shared specific characteristics. They were usually outspoken, poor, and seen as an affront to the concept of femininity. Likewise, both practices were employed just as much to deter others from committing similar sins as they were to actually punish the accused. And like the witchcraft trials, ducking took many years to fall out of fashion. The last known public instance of ducking in England was in 1809, when Jenny Pipes was accused of speaking ill of her husband. God forfend. But the crime of being a common scold remained on the books until 1967. Today, the ducking stool used on Jenny Pipes can be seen at Leominster Priory. Whether as a witchcraft trial or ducking stool, it stands as a reminder of the dark and often unjust punishments from our past. Thank you for watching. Right then, take care, and I'll see you next time with another story to make you say, well, I never.